Like she was just this amazing, like a tornado.
Yeah.
Um, and so Annie hopes to learn from her. But unfortunately, the night of the Met Gala, things go terribly wrong, which was the most fun to write.
Welcome to our latest episode of Book Reporter Talks To, where our guest today is Fiona Davis, and we're going to be talking about her latest novel, The Stolen Queen. My gosh, this book is great. It's a Book Reporter Bets On selection. I cannot wait for people to read this book and start talking to me about it because it's just terrific. Look, I liked her seven books, the seven previous books. I like them all. This is my favorite, and I'm just going out on a limb and saying that right now. They're all set in iconic New York buildings, and we know that. And at one point, I tried to get her to write about the one that was across the street from my office so she would hang out with me all day. I think the Wyoming is still, ready for a book, but we're not working there anymore. But I think this is really my favorite. And I did something different this time. I listened to the book on audio instead of reading. And shouldn't say instead of reading. That's how I read it, was on audio. And Linda Jones is just a terrific narrator. If you're up for listening on audio, highly recommend it. We're recording this interview in advance of The Stolen Queen coming out next week. So our review isn't in, but there's some really great industry praise that I want to share. From Publishers Weekly, alluring, the action-packed novel brims with Davis's customary meticulous research, we're going to talk about that, and insight into debates over whether artifacts should remain in the country of origin. There's plenty of substance to this rousing adventure. And from Booklist, with the themes of antiquities, repatriation, personal loss, and women's resilience, The Stolen Queen is a captivating exploration of identity and strength with twists that will compel readers till the very end. And with that intro, welcome, Fiona.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. This book is so close to my heart, so it means so much that you responded the way you did to it.
I could tell. I can tell that the characters were close to your heart, and you just feel it. And even though she was narrating, I felt like you were telling me the story. I really did. It's like it was just, came out that well. So let's start with you giving your overview of The Stolen Queen. What do we have here?
Sure. So The Stolen Queen is set at the Met Museum in New York City, and it's 1978. And part of the story is from the point of view of this very serious, enigmatic curator named Charlotte. And she unwillingly has to team up with the overeager 19-year-old assistant to Diana Vreeland at the Met Gala in order to track down a stolen artifact that, for very personal reasons, they're very invested in. And part of the book takes place in 1930s Egypt, when the curator was just a young woman, just starting out. And I like to say it's about mothers and daughters, female friendships. There are hidden secrets. There's a deadly curse. And I like to say it's a mix of glamour and mummies.
Glamour and mummies. I love it. Glamour and mummies. I can understand you selecting the Met for the location for this book because you've done all these fabulous iconic buildings, but what is really the big one, the Met? And you maybe want to go there again and just go explore with my now limited knowledge of Egyptian art, because believe me, I'm no docent about this at all. What inspired you to particularly take the Egyptian wing, Met Gala, like those parts of this museum and put them as part of the story?
It's a very strange beginning, to be honest. I read this article in the New York Times about the Met Gala of 2018, and Kim Kardashian was there.
Yes.
And she wore this gold dress that was all glittery. And at some point during the evening, she stood next to this gold sarcophagus that the Met had just bought a year ago for $4 million. And so you had these two gold sparkly, people, statured. And the photo went viral, as you would expect, to the point where the guy who had smuggled the sarcophagus out of Egypt saw it. And he complained to an undercover informant that he hadn't gotten paid. That got back to the Manhattan DA's office that has a whole unit on stolen art. And they went through the papers, and it turned out the export license had been forged. It was falsified. And so the Met had to give it back. And I just thought, I read that and I thought, what a great mix of pop culture and ancient art all
Exactly.
embodied in this one building. And that's when I knew I had my way in.
Wow. Was that the year she poured herself into the what's her name's dress? Or was
Oh,
it?
Yeah, it might have been because don't they change a few times?
Yes. Well, yeah, when she was kind of like, were you going to rip the dress? And
Right,
it was
Marilyn
Marilyn
Monroe's
Monroe's
dress.
dress. And I'm
Hmm.
trying to figure out if that was the year she wore that.
It
It's about,
might have been. The one she wore in the museum was this gold glittery one, which was really pretty
yeah.
stunning. And I have to tell readers, Kim Kardashian is not in the book. Who did inspire the book.
It's amazing that Kim Kardashian inspired a book about Egyptian artifacts. I mean, we're really going deep here there, folks, you know.
I hadn't
But
thought of that.
yeah, yeah, Kim Kardashian inspires. I can just see the headlines now. Oh my gosh, don't pick that up, folks. Don't pick that up, you know. But how much time did you spend in the Egyptian wing then as you were trying to cultivate what the story was going to be?
I spent a lot of time, wandering around, seeing what jumped out at me, what artifacts I thought might be interesting to recreate in the book. So yeah, and I spoke with curators and conservators and art handlers and technicians and Met staffers, docents, just everyone I could talk to about how that building works, because it really is like a small city. There's so much going on.
Exactly. And there are things that are where the exhibits are being moved around, that an exhibit is going to be opening. And you actually are framing this up against the King Tut exhibit. And that was, I remember that in 1978. I think it's the other time I remember time tickets happening. You had to be there at a certain time to get in, which was something you hadn't had before. Um, I can see what drew you to that time period, like what was going on. So when you were there doing research, were they really like, did you just say, "Hi, I'm Fiona Davis. These are the other books I've written. This is what I want to do." At this point in your career, what do you do to try to get entree to get the information you need?
Yeah, they were so helpful. The first thing I did was reach out to their communications department, and the head of that, who's no longer there, but the head of that was so generous, and he took me on a tour and took me down to the staff caf, which is where they all eat, the cafeteria. We walked along these hallways in the basement that have these signs every so often that say "Yield to art and transit."
Wow.
If
Wow.
art's being rolled by, you have to flatten yourself against the wall. And so that was very cool. And then he, introduced me to curators in the Egyptian wing, to some Met staffers who worked on the Met Gala and the Costume Institute, that kind of thing. So gradually, my web kind of grew. One really interesting person I met was a man named Patrick Bringley, and he had been a security guard there for 10 years. And he left and wrote a memoir about it called All the Beauty in the World, which is just hit the New York Times list recently. It's a beautiful memoir. And I met him before his book came out, and he gave me a tour from his point of view of what it was like to be a security guard. And so by doing that, you could really shape everything together. I remember going through the Egyptian collection with a woman, Dr. Colleen Darnell, and she is an Egyptologist. And so she took us around, and there she was reading the hieroglyphs right off the tombs.
Wow.
It was so cool.
So, and there's a moment that you're in New York, but you come into this place where you actually feel like you're in ancient Egypt. When you go in and you're reading, and it's beyond you, a lot of the understanding for most of us of like, what is actually happening there. But you realize, and I think you do such a good job of what the digs were like in the 1930s, and who does own the art? Where should it go? What should it be ending up happening with it? So why 1936 particularly? Would you do your math going backwards and say that would make sense? Or what was going on? Is before the war? What was going on?
Yeah, what actually started with the 1930s is the idea, because I read this book called Empress of the Nile by Lynn Olson. It's a nonfiction book about a woman named Christiane de Roche Noblecourt, who was a French resistance fighter, saved all this artwork from the Louvre during the World War II. She went to Egypt, had all these remarkable finds. Her life story is incredible. And there were details in there like, when they set up their tents in the desert and they had cots that they'd sleep on, you would put a cup of water under each leg to stop the scorpions from crawling up.
Ooh, how
And
nice.
that kind of detail is,
That
as an
detail.
author, you're like, oh yeah, that I can play with that.
Mhm.
And so I thought, how cool to have a female archaeologist in the 1930s. And then I kind of thought, okay, if I want her young, and then I want her older. And so
Hmm.
in 78, she's 60.
Right.
And so you can see how she's changed over time and how she's hardened, and is really struggling as a older woman. And through the story you figure out why and what she needs to do to kind of release herself from the prison that she's put herself in.
Yeah, she's put herself in a prison, and she's also very protective of everything in the exhibits, everything in the museum. because she knows where from whence it came, from where it came, and to try to get it from there and how to move things around. And as a result, Annie, who's our younger character, she sees a little bit of herself in Annie in some ways also, because she remembers being that kid who was just plucked and, dropped into a situation. Was not really ready for it at this point, but she's got the enthusiasm that's needed and the desire that's needed. So is that what, sort of you took on Annie at that point as well?
Yeah, I love the idea of contrasting putting together an older woman and a younger woman.
Hmm.
And kind of putting them together. And then the one's from the Egyptian collection, the other one is from the Costume Institute. So
Right.
these are two hugely different parts of the museum. And then putting them together and seeing what happened. And so Annie, I love because she's a parentified child. So she has to take care of her mom. Her mom is incapable of just emotionally of living in the world in many ways. And so Annie stepped up her whole life to take care of her. And she finally is able to get a break and get a job working for Diana Vreeland for the Met Gala, which is a high, really tough position. It's really her first job, and she wants to do really, really well. And so by pairing those two up, it was really fun to show different aspects of the museum, as well as see, that's when the generation gap was talked about, right? In the 60s and
Hmm.
70s.
Right.
And to play with that idea of these two women and what they each bring to each other that might release the pain that each other is in.
Hmm. And they're both coming from places of not being the in crowd. They're both have like skirted on the outside. And we're looking at, they both have had parental issues. One was, why are you doing this? And the other one was, why are you doing this in a very different way? Like, where is your money going to come from? How are you going to take care of yourself? And it was really 1978 for women. It was really different from now. And you bring up a lot of that in the book of these characters. It wasn't footloose and fancy free. It was you really needed to earn your way and you needed to figure out what's going on.
Yeah, and it's not easy. As a woman, you couldn't get a credit card or a bank loan without a male co-signing it until the mid 70s, which
Right.
is shocking to realize. And so, yeah, Charlotte, when it kind of against her parents' wishes to go to Egypt, and a lot went wrong. And so she's kind of paying penance the rest of her life
Hmm.
in many ways for what she feels was a terrible tragedy that occurred to her. And and she's overlooked at the museum. She's the hardest worker. She knows everything that's going on, but she doesn't get any of the glory.
Right.
And then you have poor Annie, who's teamed up with Deanna Vreeland, who was such a fashion icon.
Yes.
Deanna Vreeland is fascinating because when she was young, her mother said she was ugly all the
Oh.
time, and yet she became this fashion icon
Mhm.
and was editor of Bazaar and Vogue. And so, she's someone who's different looking. She's not typically pretty. She had black lacquered hair and pale skin, and she would put rouge on her cheeks and her earlobes. She would put Vaseline above her eyes. Like she was just this amazing, just this, uh, like a tornado.
Yeah.
Um, and so Annie hopes to learn from her. But unfortunately, the night of the Met Gala, things go terribly wrong, which was the most fun to write, I have to say.
I bet that scene was so much fun to write. And we were giving nothing away about it,
No.
but it was just such a fun scene. Deanna Freeland, I worked at Condé Nast from 78 to 1995. And it
Mhm.
was really the heydays of magazines. I mean, it was when I started there, Condé Nast had 5 magazines, and it was the day where you got the magazine and you sat down and you read it from cover to cover. And it was funny because I look at the grocery store when you're on the line and you see these magazines. First of all, they're that thick, and it's a whole issue on Taylor Swift or a whole issue on, like, I don't know, just the people. Like celebrity has become everything. Celebrity, the cover girls were models then. Now it's all celebrity. It's the whole culture has changed. But I want to say it was the golden age of that whole magazine thing from was about the 70s. And I'm not just saying it because I was there then till about like 2000. And that was the sweet spot. Graydon Carter's got a book coming out and he's putting the year later than me. I'm like, no, Graydon. It's as soon as the internet was invented,
Yeah.
the internet, as soon as Epicurious was launching in like 1996, we were moving very quickly. And I remember Cy Newhouse saying, print will never go away. And as a result, the investment in the other like really wasn't happening. But you had these doyens of fashion at the time, and you knew their names. You knew Grace Mirabella, who had usurped her in her position at Vogue. So what you've got is Diana Vreeland. You've got this doyen of fashion. You've got these people who lived, ate, and slept fashion. And when I tell you that when they were going to Paris to look at collections or in the collections in Milan or New York, the whole place was a buzz. I mean, when those clothes came in, the excitement, and I don't think fashion is like that right now. Fashion is costume now compared to what it was then. So you've got this young girl who trips on this great idea, brings it to Diana Vreeland of what to use as part of the gala. And all of a sudden, she gets to be the assistant. And you can see the craziness of how that could happen. And then she looks at her and she's like, those shoes must go. I remember being like, why am I wearing this little Catholic school outfit when no one else looks like me in this entire room? So you captured that kind of a feeling as well, which was very much what Annie was up against. So tell us about her because she's just such a fun character.
Yeah, Annie was so much fun to write. She loves fashion very much, but she has no experience in the world other than as a cleaner and as working as a waitress. So she just, lucks into this kind of unexpectedly. And I have to say, putting her head to head with Diana Vreeland was so much fun because her voice, a lot of what she says in the book is exactly what she said. She spoke in the most unusual cadences and came up with things like pink is the navy blue of India and the best thing about London is Paris. She would have these enigmatic sayings that I had to include some of them in the book because they were so great. And she's known for discovering models like Angelica Houston and Lauren
Yeah.
Hutton, who were unusual. They weren't your typical American pretty girl. And Annie's not your typical American pretty girl,
No,
not the
no.
cheerleader type. She's a little more unusual. And so through Deanna Vreeland, she learns to embrace what others might consider her faults and to stress them, which is what Deanna Vreeland did.
Yeah.
She took what people criticized about her and made that into her style.
Yeah, laid it into her
So
style, her story, and her persona of I'm going to go here and I'm going to learn everything about it. But then the interesting thing is she can stop and go to something else and start like learning about something else all over again. And it was interesting because there was a way to get to be the model at the cover of Vogue. You usually were on another book on one of the other magazines, and we used to be at Mademoiselle like the entry level for a lot of the models. They start there first. And it was things like they try to see if the light from the photographer's camera could be on their eyes to pull you into the picture. So you'd be pulled to buy the magazine because the way they were looking at you. It's really interesting things that we don't think about at all anymore. Yet, what you're talking about is Egypt and history that hasn't changed. Like there are parts of the world that are still galvanizing and interesting to people, but by the same token, they haven't changed. It's like you're looking at a period of history where there's a lot to still be learned, but there was a lot learned early that people are just ignoring at this point. And I think that was one of the interesting things about the book was drawing people into something they might not be thinking about right now.
yeah, and that's what's cool is that you look at the Met Gala, which when Deanna Vreeland was doing it that year, there were stuffed peacocks. There were the costumes from this ballet company called Ballet Russe that was being honored. She infused the exhibition hall with perfume
Yes.
because she wanted to be in control of what it smelled like. And then you go to a tomb in ancient Egypt that's just been opened and you find this, amazing artifact or a mummy.
Mhm.
And so to play with both of those in the book and also what is art? Is art stuffed peacocks and perfume, or is it these items from 3,500 years ago that we've just recently discovered? And what are the stories that these items tell? And
Right.
so, yeah, there was just so much to play with here. I enjoyed every minute.
Even the role of women in ancient Egypt becomes
Mhm.
part of the story and who could actually tell the story or be part of the history. Was this woman ever allowed to be part of the history that the mummy that we're talking about? And is she important or because she was a woman, was she just overlooked?
She's fascinating. It's the mummy in the book is called Hathor Kare, and she's based on a real pharaoh, a female pharaoh called Hatshepsut, who ruled in the New Kingdom. And her story is just fascinating. And I knew I had to include it in the book where she was married to her half brother at 12, as one did in Egypt. He died 7 years later, but she hadn't had a male child. So the infant child of one of the concubines became the pharaoh. But she stepped in as regent and she ruled for 20 years really successfully. There was economic prosperity, there was peace, there was international trade. But then after she died, the stepson who took power ordered her statues destroyed,
Mm,
and her reliefs hacked. And so in that way, she was lost to history. She was erased from history because no one really, they knew she ruled, but she didn't seem that important.
right.
Till the 1920s when the Met were excavating and they found this quarry filled with these broken statues and they put them together and realized, no, this was a really important woman.
Wow.
What happened? But even then, they describe her in the catalog as a vain, ambitious, and unscrupulous woman and a detested stepmother.
Mm,
It's not until later that we learn, and you'll learn in the book, that in fact, no, that wasn't true. And so Charlotte, who's doing all this work of figuring out who this woman was, realized this is a woman who was revered and then erased and then reviled and then finally restored.
mhm.
And so she wants to restore this woman's legacy as a way of lifting up all women.
Right, right. Have you spent time in Egypt? Have you been
Yeah.
there?
Yeah, we went there for 10 days. It was
You did.
incredible.
Did you actually go to what is it, the Valley of the Kings? So tell me about, okay, Valley of the Kings. Tell us where that is in Egypt, or what actually happens there.
Yeah, so the Valley of the Kings is this place where around 60 pharaohs were buried, and it was considered inaccessible, and it was hoped that they wouldn't be robbed, the tombs, because they were filled with riches. And King
Mm.
Tut, of course, was found there in the 1920s, and that one was untouched and full of, there was chariots and toys and food, everything that one could want in the afterlife. But you can still go in a number of these tombs and they're beautifully painted. Like there's just hieroglyphics and paint. It's just stunning when you go inside and they're very quiet and dark. And you just think of how long ago they were created.
Right.
And so yeah, that was an incredible part of the trip. And having the character of Charlotte as a young woman go into one of these tombs and discover something was really fun to recreate because I went there so that I could describe what does it smell like? What does it feel like? What's it like when the sand blocks the sun and everything turns orange?
Hmm.
That way the reader hopefully gets a trip to Egypt as well.
You could tell you were there. You could tell, like I was asking the question, but I was like, she had to have been there because it's got a different look and feel than other places in the world from the way you were describing it. And I think the opportunity must have been amazing. And did you go, went knowing you were going to do research for the book? Did you get entree to some places as a result of that? Or were you just being, I'm just going to go look on my own?
Yeah, no entree. But we had a great tour guide and he knew everything. So whenever he wasn't giving a tour, I had him cornered. And I was like, taking notes with my notebook. I was the only person on there with a notebook and a pen,
Right.
scribbling away. But it was a great tour and we started in Cairo. We sailed up the Nile. We, went to all these temples, the Temple of Karnak. It was just incredible. We went to museums. And the most incredible thing was near the end, we went to Cairo and we went to the museum that holds the mummy of Hatshepsut,
Oh, wow.
female pharaoh. And so you go into this room and it's dark and very quiet. And I was walking around and looking at her and thinking, that's the actual woman. Like she actually walked the earth 35 years ago, 3,500 years ago as a pharaoh. She ruled Egypt. Those are her fingernails. That's her hair. It was so it was just awe-inspiring in the way that suddenly time seemed to compress.
Right. And then you also feel like I want to tell her story as well. Like I never met her and I've read a lot about her, but I wanted to bring it forth. And I think that's one of the reasons I really like listening to the audio as well, because the pronunciations of all the words that I'm not going to even try and do right now. But it was so beautifully done that you really felt like you were in the place. And you felt like when a sandstorm came through, you were huddled down with everybody else in the tent. You were like zipping the tent up as well, you know?
Good, good. Yeah, yeah. It was a lot of fun. And the interesting thing was learning about women in ancient Egypt, which you were mentioning before, often had more rights than women in the 70s, where in the ancient era they were allowed to get divorced. You could have a child out of wedlock. It was no big deal. You could have sex out of wedlock, no big deal. If you divorced, you could keep your property. Women
Mhm.
could own property. There was all these things that in a way they were so much more advanced than we were in the 70s.
Yeah, and where we are now. You know, it's also, but you also see Charlotte coming more into her own in the book. Like Charlotte and Annie both have this coming into their own. And you also are seeing that up against this what was going on in Egypt and this woman coming into her own and her story. But you realize how fast these women's stories could be hidden because the men would take over. And I just like that they were like smart, strong women that needed a big break to get stronger. That's the way I was seeing them. And they were going to become their own versions of leaders. They were going to become their own versions of it by what was happening. So
Yeah,
I
I
just
like
love.
to think it's like Indiana Jones meets Thelma and Louise meets The Devil Wears Prada.
Oh, wait, do that one again. I love that. That's
Indiana Jones meets Thelma and Louise meets The Devil Wears Prada. Yeah.
perfect. Absolutely perfect. I love that. I love that. It was the pronunciations really helped. And in your author's note, you mentioned a number of books that you would recommend that people do for further reading. Is there one particular that if somebody's doing a book group, you could say, read this one to sort of enhance your discussion? Is there one you turn people towards?
I would do Patrick Bringley's All the
Okay.
Beauty in the World because he takes you in behind the scenes at the museum
Hmm.
as well as behind the art. He wrote it after his brother died of his older brother died of cancer.
Hmm.
And he'd been working for the New Yorker and he thought, I don't want this job anymore. And he wanted a job where he could just sit and think or stand and think. And so he took on a job as a security guard at the Met. And his
Wow.
way he sees the paintings after looking at them for so many years and the way the interaction between the people who work there and the people who visit, it's just a beautiful book. It's a real celebration of the Met.
Okay, that's the one. That's the one. We're going to see if we can get that listed as well, because that's what I'm looking for is something where we would sit there and take it away and say, if I want to know more about the museum, because the museum is, you could spend a week there and never, I feel, see everything. And I love to go with my friend Beverly, who was very into fashion. When we used to do fashion shows, she talked about the fashion. I warmed up the crowd because I wouldn't know a peplum from a this, that, the other thing. So, but she goes and looks at the costume exhibit every year with the detail. And some years are so much better than others. And some are too bizarre and over the top. And it's just not, it doesn't feel like fashion. It just doesn't. I was looking through the fashion section of the Times, styles of the Times, and I was just looking, I was like, these are like unwearable clothes. And they used to have unwearable clothes, but now it's really unwearable, even by people wearing really unwearable things. It's just, it's taken this turn that it's fashion is art. Fashion used to be more like art, and now it's more like, I don't know, celebrity or ostentatious. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And you know, the recent Costume Institute exhibit, they had some old clothes that like Sleeping Beauties. They were laid out. They couldn't be hung because they were so
Right.
delicate. And you could see where the shoulder had worn away because clearly someone had worn these clothes. And there was something really beautiful and gracious about the way they laid them out.
Hmm.
And they were stunning.
Yeah, and it's just, where are we going to look for what's art and what's beauty at different times in history, and how this woman was revered at that time and then erased, like, whoosh, there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really just love the characters. I mean, the book I was listening to, and I couldn't wait to get back in the car or wherever I was. I was reading like on the way to listening on the way to the health club. Like, there's 15 minutes, maybe I'll draw the longer route home. Oh yeah, that would be good because I could hear more. And I was actually sitting at my desk listening a lot because it was just so well done. But I wasn't looking up places in Egypt. I wasn't looking up. I wasn't doing that kind of history because I was so immersed in the story. But when I finished, I was like, okay, tour of the Met goes on the list and let's do some further reading. So, here you go.
Oh, that's great. I love to hear that. And I always explain in the author's note very clearly what's fact, what's fiction, and then
Yes.
lead the reader to all the rabbit holes that I went down because
Yeah.
that's fun.
But you've also got this mystery woven through the book. There's mystery besides what's happening. There's mystery in this woman's life of what ended up happening. We're not going to go deeply into this. Did you have that plotted from the start, or I mean, I know you said you often don't write like with a big completely scripted in advance. You more like go with seat of your pants. What were you doing to weave this mystery throughout the whole thing as well?
I knew I wanted to focus on mothers and daughters because it's not something I'd done in prior books. I don't have children.
Mhm.
And so I think I'd kept away from it. But as my parents have gotten older and my dad passed away, I wanted to explore that dynamic in a book. And so that's why I decided to do that. And I had an idea of what was going to happen, but it actually changed dramatically at the end.
Mhm.
Um, and that was the way to do it. My editor pointed that out. And so, and then on top of that, you have the mystery of the stolen artifact, and that's why the two women have to team up to try and track it down when it gets taken back to Egypt. And so, yeah, so the stolen queen in the name really refers to Hatshepsut, who had her, name stolen from her, basically. There's the statue in the book that's based on a statue called Fragment of a Queen's Face, which is just the lips and the chin of
Hmm.
this beautiful, beautiful statue. I can only imagine how gorgeous the rest of it had been because the lips and chin are the most stunning thing. And so in the book, that gets stolen. And so that's the literal reason. And then you also have, Charlotte, who has had so much stolen from her in many ways.
Yeah.
And how do you find the answers to things that happened in the past?
Yeah. And it's like, where are you going to go discover you were there, you weren't there, what ends up happening? And in the intervening years, what was the toll on you and what did that end up taking as well? And I think that you really see these characters and what they've been through, at the same time. So, okay, when you talk about the collar, like it's the collar, what is a collar? It sounds really dumb. Like I know what a collar
No,
is on a
no,
shirt, but what is the medieval collar? Because they play such a big role in the story.
yeah, it's called a broad collar and it's got a lot of layers. It's kind of it's like if a necklace, there were like four necklaces and they were all joined together by little amulets. So it's broad. It's a very broad
Gotcha.
necklace. If you Google it, you can see at the Met. And the one that I refer to, all the amulets on it are nephers, which means good or beautiful
Mhm.
in Egyptian hieroglyphics. And it was owned by the wife of a pharaoh. And so the royalty and the elite wore these broad collars, and they're just very intricate and just a layered necklace is the way I describe it.
Necklaces. This was the book that I thought I wanted like pictures in as well. Like here's a novel that I'd like some pictures in, just so that I think on your website, the pictures, lots of pic, or
In
send
fact,
us to places to go find the pictures. It was great.
what's so funny is a good friend of mine who's a singer-songwriter. She wrote a
Yes.
song that's
Yes.
based inspired by the book. And we did a video together, and in it, I'm wearing a broad collar and it gets magically transferred to each other. Like a
Oh, I've got to find that. I've got to
yeah,
find that
we're releasing the video on the 8th,
on the 8th.
the
Okay.
7th or the 8th, yeah. And so yeah, it's called Forgotten Queen, and it's the most beautiful song. In the video, you'll see a broad collar.
It is. And I listened to the song because I listened to the audio advance, and it was,
Oh
I said,
yes,
why is there a song on here? And then I was like, oh, okay, now I
that's
think I'm
a new
putting it all together.
song. Yeah, yeah.
So at any time when you were writing, or did you paint yourself into a corner? Like, wait a second, why am I here? And I can't be in this corner, and I've got to get out of here because this is such a big story in so many ways because we've got the 1938, we've got now, it really is my favorite of your books because it's so complex of everything that's going on. So did you get into a corner at some point and
Oh,
say, why am I here?
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And I finished the first draft and I knew it needed something and I couldn't figure it out. And I was complaining about it to Linda Cohen-Leugman, who's a
Yeah.
wonderful writer. I
Yes.
said, just send it to me. And I sent it to her, and within a day, she wrote back, reorder all the chapters this way in the first half. And she was absolutely right. Like she got the action moving quicker, all the things that you can't see because you can't see the forest for the trees. So a huge shout out for her
Wow.
get figuring that out. But there were a number of times where I was like, okay, what do I do now? Because it is complex and there's a lot going on. But in the end, it's so satisfying when all those puzzle pieces click into place. It's the
Yeah.
best feeling in the world when you're like, oh, I've got it.
Yeah.
This will work.
I just saw the way it was all switching. And at any moment in any part of this, whether they were in Egypt, when they were leaving Egypt, any single place, it could have been, now where do I go from here?
Yeah.
And Annie, comes in, but she's not there like right at the beginning. We've got to get the whole setup of what's happening. And then you introduce her, and then it's like, where do we go from there? I'm always fascinated by like, is there a character that got left out, or is there something else that like, completely changed as you were writing? But it's more like you just saw like if you reorder it, it just becomes smoother.
Yeah, yeah. And there were definitely characters who dropped out or who became more important.
Hmm.
That always happens in a first draft where you're not quite sure of who's who just yet.
Yeah.
But the main thing to me, I always knew kind of the big moment in the book would be at the Met Gala where I was like, okay, what's the worst thing that could happen at the costume exhibit? And oh, let's do that. And so, just to have that kind of force the two women together, force the story into a whole other, country
Yeah.
was a lot of fun. And I always knew that was going to happen.
I tell you, well, the way that happens there, I was, oh my gosh, that it could be like the worst thing that could happen. And it would just, you think it's going to be this and it's this. And it was just, the play through was great. And to see what had happened on the back end to make it happen. And I'm just trying to get people to read the book. I mean, I'm not giving anything away, folks, because you're just going to enjoy this experience. It's just going to be so much fun. So talks about the title. Was it always The Stolen Queen?
I'm so bad at titles, I can never come up with them. And the team came up with that. My agent and my editor
Oh,
kind
it's
of came
great.
up with that. It's hard because you need a title that refers to the characters and the story and the building. And so I thought they did a beautiful job, especially with that cover.
Cover's exquisite. It really is. And I'm just looking at the arc. I'm not looking at a final copy, and it's just beautiful. Just
Yeah.
the way that you would see the image back, oh, the broad collar back here, the broad
Yes, there
collar.
you go. There's the bright. Yes, that's
Yeah,
it.
there it is, just for me, just for my eyes of not understanding. On the outside of the Met. Are they going to be selling the book at the Met?
Yeah, they will, which
I,
is really wonderful. It's a dream.
it's a
Yeah.
dream. I'm a dream. I was like, wait a second, not only am I going to go visit the Met, my book will be sold at the Met.
And what's so funny is that the New York Public Library sells so many copies of the Lions of Fifth Avenue. And I go there every month and sign hundreds of copies and they go out the door. And then the Frick is reopening in April. So I'm hoping they'll have copies there too, because that's going to be really exciting when they reopen. I know a
I
lot
tell
of people are excited to get inside there.
I tell you, I would love to go on a tour of the Egyptian wing with you. I mean, it would be like, this is where I got this idea. This is where this came from, and whatever. It'd be, the tour with Fiona. And they actually should do something because they could sell a lot more books. And it's also a gateway into a part of the museum that people may be fascinated by, but overwhelmed by.
Yes.
And because I feel like if I go there, I'm like, what am I looking at? Because I don't understand what these things are. Like King Tut, there was a complete explanation, but most things, that's nice.
And it's nice to be able to say, go to the fragment of a queen's face and see that and understand what it's about because you've read about it in the book, or go to the gallery that just has Hatshepsut statues that have all been recreated and
Right.
just see, all right, here's the woman. And she was interesting because her early figures were very female, but as she kept on the reign, she made them into men.
Hmm.
And so, as a way of kind of keeping order and retaining power. And so there's just so many kind of little things you can see as you walk in that you might not know otherwise.
Yeah, they're different gateways and like I said, it made me want to go back to the Met.
Yeah.
And I actually took courses at the Met when I was in college. I was at Fordham, and there were art courses that were given down at the Met.
Oh,
Yes, literally.
oh,
That's where you could spend your Tuesday afternoons for an entire semester. And we
heaven.
take the train down and just get off at the stop. And it was marvelous. And I feel like so much of education should really move into that kind of direction of that hands-on going to look at someplace instead of these complex readings and whatever, that it's not going to give you that full understanding of what's going on. And to be in the city going to school and be able to have those kind of opportunities was huge, to be able to do
Yeah.
that.
What I love to say is that, instead of going to the Met, which is such an incredible institution, but looking at it as a bunch of objects, look at it as a collection of stories
Hmm.
and how we can really enrich our sense of the past by looking at these stories and how they've changed over time.
Yeah. And what has stayed the same, and where
Mhm.
things were better back then, and where we are now. So Linda Jones narrates. Her narration, I think, is terrific. I think she does all the voices extremely well. Did you know you wanted her to narrate, or yeah, you're usually given a couple of voices, but did you like right away say, "Wait, she's going to do it"?
They sent me a few voices and I heard that one and I said, "Oh, I love that one." And then I remember the director of the audiobook said, "Yes, me too." So,
Yeah.
yeah.
She's really, it's really, really, it's one of those experiences where she does the voices well. You can picture Annie, you can picture what's going on, but you also feel let's see, the might of the museum and the might of what was going on in Egypt. And I think that we're looking at two mighty places, and you brought them both to life of the places that we really don't know. And in her talking about it, or her telling the story, it sounded like, oh, this is just telling me a story about what was going on in ancient Egypt and then over here. And sometimes the narrator can destroy a story because they're just not good at telling it. But I felt like her voice was authoritative yet friendly enough, if that makes sense, to be telling the whole thing.
Yeah, oh, I love the way you put that. I think that's exactly right. And yeah, I think I have such respect for audiobook narrators. It
Oh,
is so much work. It's
so much.
exhausting. And they have to
Right.
keep everything in their head as to how to pronounce these crazy names. So yeah, she did an unbelievable job, and I was very lucky to get her.
Yeah, no, and it felt like at the end of the story, there's sometimes you close a book and you just forget about the book. Okay, the book. But here I find myself thinking about the characters, and I think it's one of the things is the way you wrote them and the way she brought them to life both had a really, and I feel like the villains in the book, and we've got villains, folks. We've got lots of villains here too. The villains came to life for me as well. And we would be able to sit there and say, wait, was that really what was happening? And you really deal with the idea of who owns art and what was stolen. And is it stolen or is it, I mean, how many more people would see it here than see it in Egypt? But is it the right people that are seeing it? Or the people who, big
Oh,
question.
that's exactly right. There's so many questions, and there are so many items that were stolen or looted from countries that are now in museums around the world. So every museum, not just the Met, are struggling with this idea of repatriation.
Yeah.
But you're right. What if the item going back to the country, there's nowhere to store it correctly? Or what if, it might get stolen because there's not enough security? Or what if the government needs money, so they sell it to a billionaire who then locks it away in his castle? And then the researchers and the scholars, no one can get access to it. And so there's all these open questions around it and no easy answers.
Right. And at the time we're so caught up in our own history and our own of what is going on. I mean, when you realize they were leaving Egypt, it was right before the Second World War and like how people had to get out. They had to leave. Everything was just getting closed up. Exploring Egypt was off the table. Everything else was, go back to your home country. And you brought in that period of history and what that meant at the same time. How many years were lost of doing the research because it just didn't continue? How many people died during that time that had started the research that someone else had to pick it up? Really, so many interesting points that you don't really think about.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. You're right. Yeah, I love this book. I feel like it's got a lot of fun layers, and
Oh,
you can read it on one level and then see a whole bunch of others lurking beneath.
I completely agree. I completely agree. And I think that book clubs, it's going to be something, but it's readable. Like, okay, I don't want to sit there and say, oh, we're reading about ancient Egypt and it's not readable. No, it's really readable because you're figuring out what the collar is here, folks. And then, where you go from there is, pretty terrific. So, what are you working on? Something new? What new building are we going to be exploring? And what can you share about it?
Yeah, so the next book I'm working on now is set at the Morris Jumel Mansion.
Oh,
No one's heard of this.
no.
No, only a few people. It's the oldest house in Manhattan.
Okay.
It's up on 160th Street. It was built in the 1700s. And in fact, George Washington headquartered there during the Revolutionary War.
Another place he slept.
Yes. And the woman who owned the house in the 1800s was this woman named Eliza Jumel. And she was born the daughter of a prostitute in Rhode Island.
Mhm.
She moved to New York to make her way, and she eventually became the richest woman in New York through her real estate holdings. She was quite brilliant. And yeah, in fact, her second husband was Aaron Burr
Huh.
from Hamilton fame.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
Lin-Manuel Miranda actually wrote some of Hamilton in Burr's bedroom at the house.
Wow.
So and it's this beautiful mansion in this gorgeous garden that no one's heard about. And I feel like the Met, everyone knows what the Met is, but the Morse Jumel Mansion could really use some love. And I thought, let's put the spotlight there next.
You're going to put this on the map. Now there are going to be people going up to 160th Street. What subway stop is 160th Street?
It's great. 160, the sea, you're right there.
Right
Yep.
there. Wow. And so you got time to do exploring up there. Now, when will we see that? 18 months from now? When?
Yeah, it'll be summer of 26. And in fact, that's the 250th anniversary of our country, believe
Uh-huh.
it or not. So it all kind of times out. That's kind of fun. So they're doing some renovations right now, and I think by then they'll be ready to roll.
How about
But
the
it's open.
Chelsea? The Chelsea reopen?
Yes, yes, it's open. It is buzzing. You go in there anytime, and like the bars are packed and the lounges are packed, and they did a great job of the renovation. It still feels very much like the old Chelsea.
Look at this. I mean, really, seriously. It's like all your locations in the city. You're going to be able to be doing, I know somebody's working on a tour, a possible tour of the city and you are one place after the next that you could just be spending the day at and getting to know. And I know there are people that follow you with the bus group that comes down from Boston to definitely spend the day at whatever location you found. So I love it. You should be given some kind of credit in New York
Like
City. I mean,
every
got to figure that out next. Is which mayoral proclamation is going to be, a day for you of taking all these places in the city and making them better known to New Yorkers and the guests.
right, exactly. I
We'll
love
start
it.
working on that. Next mayor, we'll start working on that. Let's get the next campaign over and then we'll worry about it.
Perfect.
Perfect. But no, there's so many locations and just the way you bring place and character to life to the reader. It's fantastic.
Oh, well, thank you. And thank you for being there since book number one.
No.
I'm so in awe of everything you've accomplished and happy to go along for the ride.
Oh, and I look forward to seeing you Monday night in person when you talk about this book, which will be really, I don't go out that often to see authors. I don't go into the city as much, let's put it that way. But they're doing more and more events in New Jersey. And I'm liking this because they can usually get good crowds at the venues. And the couple of venues are really good at pulling together audiences. So I absolutely love that. I don't have to go across the river. So it's just fine.
I will see you there. I can't wait.
I'm looking forward to it. Thank you so much for joining us in advance of publication. To everybody, you're going to really enjoy this book. We look forward to hearing your feedback on it as well. And we'll see you next time on Book Reporter Talks to. Thanks, everybody.